I want to talk to you a little bit today about some of the myths and realities about transition. And, ideally, this would have been front-loaded in this week's summit to kind of set the stage for some things. But unfortunately, I was busy hosting a summit on Tuesday, speaking yesterday, and spending the night on an airport bench last night. So today is where you get this. But hopefully, it firms up or maybe even causes some tension with some other ideas that have been presented. And I love that part. Not because I have all the right answers, but I think tension and friction between ideas is where we find the best ideas that really are most meaningful for veterans who are trying to transition into their new realities, and that's after serving. I always believe in starting with why. Why should we care about civilian-military divide or drift? Why should we care about military transition? For me, it comes from my experience, 20 years in the Air Force. I was a military police officer or a security forces officer, we call them in the Air Force, for 20 years. And my job was to tell people no for a living, right? No, you don't want to do that. No, you really don't want to do that, because then I have to put steel handcuffs on you and we have a bad day. But I also tell people that I was kind of a social worker with a gun, right? I got to deal with people in moments of crises, but instead of scheduling the next counseling session, I had some authority to do something else with them and give them to somebody else as a problem. But I joke about that. The reality is, in my last tour on the Joint Staff, I had the opportunity to travel around the country for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and help communities build capacity to reintegrate veterans and service members and their families after serving. And in that role, I got to help people find yes instead of saying no for a living, and it felt so much better. So that was my experience that led me into this work, continuing to advocate for veterans by advocating and providing resources to organizations that directly serve them. In my first few months in the job, I looked around for the trade association that managed the then 48,000 organizations serving veterans and military families, plus government counterparts, and there wasn't one. So on the back of a napkin, we created one. It took 2.5 years to go to market, and here we are a year and a half after that. That's my personal story and my why and why we do this. Each person in this room who does this work has your own why. And sometimes we get distracted by that. We get distracted by policies and paradigms and business models and research funding. And we lose sight of the reason that maybe we do this work in the first place, and that's the individual person that's affected our lives, or we're proud or honored that they've served us. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go through these realities that I'm going to describe today. What my job today is to kind of tee up a general landscape of the civ-mil drift instead of divide, and then we're going to go deeper into how that plays out in higher education context with the presentations of my co-panelists. So stay with me today a little bit. If I do nod off again, someone pick this up and keep going. I think first of all, terms matter. The title of this session is not the typical civ-mil divide. It's civ-mil drift. And each of those words is important. First of all, military. There are people who have worn the uniform in our country as a guardsman or reservist and never been mobilized to active duty or never deployed who don't even consider themselves part of the military. It's a weird thing. But when we say we're talking in a general inclusive context, anyone who's worn the uniform for a day has been a service member, is eventually a veteran if things go well. Similarly, the word civilian is unusual in that you don't talk, those of you who've never worn the uniform, you don't talk and refer to each other as civilians. You're just people, Americans, neighbors, husbands, wives, fathers, right? You don't say, hey, did you see that civilian over there getting lunch? I mean, it's just not, it's not a term that is used outside of a military or in a law enforcement context. Law enforcement does that as well, like civilians versus police, right? So that word just makes this even a bigger problem, because many people who have no affiliation with the military, when they talk about civilians, they think the people who work on the base that don't wear the uniform, the government employees, they think that's the civilian. Well, yeah, those are GS civilian employees. So that makes it even harder. But the context we're trying to say is those who've worn the uniform at one point or not in their life, one point in their life, and those who haven't. That's really the first part of this term. And the reason we say drift, I prefer drift versus divide. Divide implies an intentional decision by both parties to separate from each other. We have decided to divide ourselves from one another. But what's really happened over time, we've just kind of drifted apart. We no longer mandatorily call up millions of men, as we did before 1973, take them out of their jobs as plumbers, HVAC specialists, lawyers, teachers, and push them out to war and then bring them back. That touched a whole broader set of the American population than we do today. We have 1%, less than 1% of our country is actively serving in uniform. That's a real small number. So it takes longer to get past your connections to find someone you may know who's currently serving. So we prefer to say drift, that it wasn't an intentional decision that I'm not going to associate with people who have worn the uniform or are wearing the uniform. They're not part of my life. They're not in my family circle. I can't even think of a cousin that's serving. Now, I would tease people to say, if you think far enough, you can probably go 6 paces out and find someone you know who's worn the uniform, and you can start to break down this drift. If those are the terms that matter, we need to talk about what is the current narrative, mostly presented by media, and what is the reality about this divide in military service. I use these two diagrams quite a bit, and at the top, the narrative that you hear and see portrayed in media and movies is that veterans fall in one of two camps, dumbbells, no pun intended. They're broke or they're heroes. That's it. There's nothing in between. You're either broken, you have PTSD, you've suffered trauma, you have an amputation, or you're a hero. You've won the Medal of Honor, you have the Silver Star, you've jumped on a grenade for your fellow men and women. The reality is we're more like the barbell at the bottom. There are heroes on the right, and they're amazing men and women. I've had the honor of serving with many of them. And then there are some who are struggling, and some would say they're slightly broken. I don't like that phrase, but they're struggling. But in the middle, there's this bell curve of job-ready, civic asset-minded veterans who just want to do something new. And because the narrative is on both sides, we forget about that population that maybe just needs a little bit of a boost to be successful in whatever they want to do next. So that's some of the challenges we see. There's a debate going on within this sector about, is the narrative set? Is that broken hero, and then sometimes they're combined to say broken leaders, that's all there is, that narrative is now so ingrained in our society it's irreversible. I don't know that I agree with that. Not really for me to decide, but it's prevalent enough that an organization like Got Your Six creates Got Your Six certified production standards for movies to say, you've got to have a more accurate portrayal of veterans and service members. The DoD has a whole office that does this for a living as well. But we want to stop stigmatizing the entire veteran population by saying that they have to be in one of these two camps. If we want to talk about the reality, that same organization, Got Your Six, in partnership with a few others, did a really interesting survey about civic assets and figuring out, are veterans more civically involved or less civically involved than their non-veteran counterparts? And the data is pretty telling, with veterans always here on the right and non-veterans on the left. If you look at the number of volunteer hours annually, 160 versus 40, donations of 25 or more to charity, 60% versus 10%. If you look at electoral participation, higher percentage registered to vote, always vote in election at a higher percentage point. Social connectedness, they trust most of their neighbors. This is a really interesting one for me, right? We have this stereotype that we don't put our back to the door, that we're fearful. Those things are real. The summit we just hosted was on PTS service dogs. Those things are real issues for some, but writ large, they trust their neighbors more. And they frequently do favors for their neighbors. In the political realm, they discuss politics more frequently with family and friends, and they reach out to public officials more. So if that's the reality, why is the narrative so distorted? And why is there this chasm between what's really going on with young men and women who've served and those who haven't? And it really comes down to process, in my view. There is an induction pathway to becoming a Marine, to becoming an airman or a soldier. And I want to just depict that to you here in this diagram. So if you work from left to right, we take young men and women who want to serve out of the 99% that are not currently serving. And we push them through this predetermined path, starting with, in the bottom picture, an oath of enlistment, basic training. And then we graduate them from basic training. We start putting them into small team work, 2-person buddy team work, 4-person fire team, 13-man platoons, squads, companies, battalions, brigades, divisions, corps. And so by the end of the induction time, which is years, we say, you are a Marine infantryman. And we give them the blessing. We say, go forth and do good things. What's interesting about the left side of this diagram is it is a dependent determination. I don't get to decide that I am now an airman. I don't know. My drill instructor says that for me if I've passed all the milestones. So I don't get to make that decision, and the timeline is set and the process is fixed. What's really interesting about these pictures, do you see anybody sitting in a classroom getting lectured at with PowerPoint slides on how to go fight war? And then on the back side, after they've served in the 1%, we thank them for serving and we let them go back out into the 99%. And it looks really pretty here. The reality is it looks more like that. We're going to take 2 years to create an F-16 pilot that is certified to fly combat missions on their own. And we're going to take 3 days to thank that pilot for serving this country, put him in a classroom like this, just like that. That's an old transition course. How old is that picture? Same thing. That's the same thing we do today. That hasn't changed. We do it in 3 days. We give them a lot of websites, a couple business cards, a couple folders, big pat on the back, probably a decoration on their way out. Say, you might want to see the VA. Good luck. No experiential learning going on at all. So why are we surprised that service members have a tough time integrating back into society? I won't even use reintegrating, because in many cases they never were in it. They left straight from high school or college, went right to service, and now they're going back to a community they never felt connected to in the first place as a real adult, if you will. So this gets really hard and very complex. As a result of these issues, and let me say this first. I don't blame the Department of Defense for this problem. Okay, let's be clear. I've had this discussion when I was still in uniform with a funder in New Mexico, and I'll never forget this, that he said, you know, why should I care about your veterans? Which back then I was a little thinner and in better shape, and I didn't take that very well, considering the fact that his son was an airman. I said, well, first of all, sir, there are veterans. They serve this country, our country. And he said, the Department of Defense needs to do a better job at making peacemakers. I said, I don't disagree with your premise. I said, I'll challenge the reality. The Department of Defense's charter is to fight and win our nation's wars, not to make peacemakers. I said, sir, your son's in the Air Force. If we make him a peacemaker and send him to war, he comes back in a box. I've brought 3 of my airmen home in a box. So let's not be confused on what the sole provider of veterans in America, also known as the Department of Defense, right? They have a monopoly on creating them, but it's not really their full job to be distracted by separating them. They are doing better, but if they focus more on the back end than the front end, things don't go well in this world for those that we send across the oceans to defend our country. And in many cases, the VA doesn't have a ton of authority here either. Let's be honest, 21 million plus veterans, only 9 million-ish are eligible for VA health care, and only about 6 access it. So what do we do with the other 15 million? VA is not everything. Some people think the VA does everything the DoD did for service members that the VA does. It's not true. They have like 3 missions, right? Benefits, health care, and cemeteries and funeral services, right? So they don't do all these other things. So this leads to a lot of realities. And specifically, if we look in kind of the employer context, on the left side, in the military, we measure risk by lives lost and mission accomplishment. But in the civilian workforce, that's usually not the gold. the measure, the standard, the commodity. It's fiscal profits, margin. That's our risk. We're going to lose too much money if we don't do this well. We're not necessarily going to lose lives, or we're not going to fail our mission. In the military, we are very adamant. I mean, anybody here been in the Army? I mean, the Army has a field manual for everything, right? You can't actually go to the bathroom without reading the field manual 1-1, right? I mean, you're probably using a page out of it when you're in the field. So it's very clear, you know your mission. And what's great about it is you know it so well, when stuff hits the fan, everyone's going. I was just in Atlanta a week ago listening to Salvatore Gunta, first living Medal of Honor recipient since Vietnam, talk about his experience in a near ambush. And I'm getting chills right now trying to reimagine this conversation he had with this group, and that they just all reacted. They're getting thousands of rounds at them a minute, and everyone did exactly what they were taught to do 4 years prior on cue. No one has to say, hey, remember, you're supposed to be bounding, and they all did. And that happens. In the civilian community, it's not always that clear in the employer realm. They perform as teams. This is one of the toughest challenges we hear from people trying to recruit and hire veterans is, I keep asking Chris, what'd you do in the Air Force? He keeps saying, we, my unit, my team. Like, I want to know what Chris did. I'm not hiring his unit. I want Chris. What did Chris do? Because we just have this, it's all about team. You win and fail as a team. And the support systems are consistent. I know my first job before creating NAVSO was with another veteran nonprofit, and I had to go through this whole benefits thing. I had to make decisions about a savings account and healthcare and all these other things that were always consistently given to me. I made those decisions once, and I kept them for 24 years in the Air Force. Go to a new base, same HR, same payroll, same benefits, not so in the civilian workforce. So it's very different. And what that leads to is some challenges. Number one, I would argue that our service members today are leaving a Super Bowl winning team. This is a very tough challenge, especially for employers. You're taking a 26-year-old who just led 13 of their peers in combat under life and death conditions, rebuilding a city and schools and electricity systems in Baghdad, Iraq, with limited resources, not enough people, life and death every day. And you've got to replicate that sense of purpose in that cubicle. Good luck. Right? It can be done, it can be done. But you got to figure out, how do I tie their passion to serve others to the bigger mission of my organization, not just these 20 tasks a day. So that's a big challenge. Most veterans are job ready, but they kind of give this, I'll do anything. That's not helpful to a recruiter, right? They're certainly going to miss the camaraderie they found in the military. I know I miss it. Most of our staff and advisors are mostly veterans. But having that camaraderie that goes on in solving tough problems and, as the Army would say, enjoying the suck, right? It's terrible, it's miserable, it's hot, it's muddy, but man, that was awesome, let's do that again, right? They don't get that. Several and many have treatable mental health issues that just aren't being addressed because of this dramatic shift in their realities. I was part of a group, and if you haven't read, I wish I would get a commission for every time I promote this book. If you haven't read the book Tribe by Sebastian Junger, I would really encourage you to read this book. It's an airplane read, as long as you're not hopping back to Atlanta. If you're going a couple hours, you can read this. You won't be able to read it because it's very riveting. But it talks about how could units that have endured some of the worst circumstances in modern history love it and love each other. And he's got some very compelling arguments out of anthropology that talk about that. But it comes from this camaraderie issue, and it creates a mental health vacuum for folks because they're not feeding those feelings they had. They don't ask for help. That's not the norm. The person who raises their hand in formation says, I need to go to sick call. Not always a popular decision, right? You do that once, or you watch someone do it once and you say, I'm never doing that. I don't care if I've got, whatever. I'm not doing it. One of the bigger challenges is system navigation. As Kate mentioned, 42,000-ish organizations serving veterans and military families. The reality is about 3,000 of those are nonprofit service providers, 501c3s. The other 69% of those are 501c19, posts and chapters of the American Legion, VFW, whose primary mission isn't to directly provide service first. They do provide some services, but they're membership organizations. So the real direct service provider number focused on this population is just over 3,000 as of last year. But still, going to each town and trying to find the one that's the right fit for me is very challenging. And it's very frustrating because they're going to go to a website and they're going to get a referral and they're going to go see that clinician and they're going to fail them and they're never going to go back to that website to find another one because they don't have a relationship with the website. Now, if they go to their buddy or their gal and go, who would you recommend I get mental health services from? And they say, hey, Sue is amazing. She got me. And they go to Sue and don't have a good experience, they'll come back and go, I didn't really like Sue. You got any other ideas? They'll get a second chance because there's a relationship there. But systems navigation is tremendously difficult. I think the most important thing here is, despite these realities and problems and the narrative challenge, the big reason is why, back to the beginning, why would we care about trying to alter these realities and improve system navigation at the local level so that veterans could succeed? And we gave you some of those early on, that they're civic assets, they're civic-minded, they're resilient, they're adaptable, they're team players. Too many people think veterans just follow checklists and do what they're told. If all my airmen did that, I'd be on the golf course every day instead of, kicking them in the hind end to get them to do the things that we ask them to do. Because they're going to butt up against what's the left and right limit? How can I maximize this position I've been given? In many cases for the right reason, sometimes not. I want to remind you that drift is real. I'm not a huge fan of the 1% number. I used it in my presentation, the 1 versus 99%, those serving versus those who haven't. But if you really take a summation of those who are serving, just over a couple million, those who have served, just under 22 million, and then also tack on every dependent, which is growing to be a derogatory term, but spouses and children thereof, those two populations, about 52 million Americans. So if you think, wow, all we have to do is bridge the gap between now 83% and 17%, a little more achievable than 99 to 1. Many veterans are thriving, and it starts in many cases by getting meaningful employment, putting both feet on the ground and providing for their family, getting some wraparound services, and now they can stop looking in and start looking out at their community and continuing to serve. Let me use one anecdote before I move over into the education space to say there's an organization, Military Missions Network, which is a faith-based effort pointing towards service members. It was designed as a platform to help service members move from Fort Bragg to Fort Hood, for example, and connect with other service members and say, I'm Baptist, I'm looking for a Baptist church, can you help me find one? When they created the platform, they said, it might not be a bad idea if we also allow the churches to list opportunities of service where once they show up, here's ways you can plug in and serve your community. So it was find a church first, maybe you can find some ways to give back. After their first year, for every click a service member took to find a church, they clicked opportunities to serve their community 3,000 times. What does that say about this continued idea of service and the way to do that? And what's really important, and that leads to the next portion of our panel, is how these promulgate in different environments. These are problems in homes, these are problems in the workplace, these are problems in your neighborhood, and they're problems in education, and far too often a lot of the solutions are aimed only at undergraduate problems. And I'm excited to let you hear about what these guys have to say about those challenges as they're promulgated in higher education, especially in law schools, med schools, and grad programs. So I will stop there. I thank you for your time, and I'm going to hand this over to these gentlemen. Thank you.